Welcome here to this LogicLounge. My name is Stefan Seider. I'm from the Vienna Center for Logic and Algorithms from TU Wien. And this LogicLounge is organized by the Vienna Center for Logic and Algorithms in collaboration with the Center for Artificial Intelligence Machine Learning, or the other way around. Thank you for coming. I think we have a very interesting program today. Just a few words on the series of LogicLounge. It was started in 2014, where we organized the Summer of Logic here. And this special format, actually here at Café Heuer, was developed by Helmut Veit together with Oliver Lehmann. They came up with this interesting format, and now since then it has been repeated many times, also in different countries. But I'm very happy that we are now back here at the point of origin, and today with two very exciting guests, Carla Gomes and Bart Selman from Cornell University. And I'm also very happy that Sarah Kriesche is moderating this. Thank you very much. She also did this already last year with Russell. I think this is a very open discussion. I think there's no fixed program. I think there will be the opportunity to ask questions already relatively soon, I guess, after first round of statements maybe. I wish you all a very interesting afternoon here, and enjoy.
Thank you so much. And just like last year, we have one microphone to share. It was interesting also with Stuart then when people had questions, but don't be intimidated us just having one microphone. Please feel free whenever you got a question, make yourself seeable. I will always look into the room because I truly think your question might be way more interesting than mine are, though I really want to have my questions there as well, to be honest. No, but as you said before, it's an open round, so take the chance to ask your questions. Since, I don't know, how long are you staying here?
Well, I've arrived yesterday. No, we arrived on Friday, and I gave a talk yesterday, and I'm leaving tomorrow.
So not much time. Take your chance. I want, of course, start with the first question, since you all read it probably. The context of Gödel and Wittgenstein and ChatGPT. That's like a broad field, and. I was like, okay, how come you had this idea, and why do you think also it's important to make this topic broader and not just have the technical aspect and not just the philosophical aspect? So we got one microphone. Who wants to start?
How many hours do we have?
So I'll start. So ChatGPT is really a transformative event in artificial intelligence. So both Carla and I have worked in artificial intelligence for decades. We realize that this is a real advance in AI that was not expected for another 2 or 3 decades. And when we in AI say 2 or 3 decades, we mean we don't really know. So we thought this would take a long time. I gave my introductory AI course in the fall at Cornell, and we went over lots of the large language models, the so-called large language models that underlie ChatGPT, have been around for several years. They, for example, drive Google Translate, is for example, a good example of a large language model that does translation. They were already quite good, but you could fairly easily identify areas where they were very poor at. The best known area in artificial intelligence was what we call common sense reasoning, which is basically our understanding of the world that we all share. And common sense reasoning is almost automatically for us. And just to give you a quick example, what you could do with Google Translate, and you can do it still with Google Translate. You can find what it lacks. And so, for example, something it lacks is if you say, the statue does not fit into the trunk because it was too large, a human immediately thinks, well, the statue must have been too large because it didn't fit into the car, the trunk of the car, or into the suitcase. Actually, that's the standard thing. It didn't fit into the suitcase because it was too large. So immediately we know that what it refers to is the suitcase or the trunk. Now, if you change the sense, say, the statue did not fit into the suitcase because it was too small, then immediately you realize, okay, the suitcase must have been too small. That's why it didn't fit. So for common sense sort of tells you what the it in English refers to. And that's called referent resolution. And you need some understanding of language and the meaning of the sentences to do that. You can show that Google Translate doesn't understand that. You have to do a little bit of trick. You have to go to a language that has gender and that has to disambiguate what it refers to. You're going to go to French. And you see that Google Translate does not understand that. Similarly, GPT-3, so this is the fall of 2020, last year, GPT-3 doesn't understand this. And you can give hundreds of examples, very easy to come up with, that humans have no trouble with understanding the sentence that the earlier, 6 months ago, the language models could not understand, okay? And we did those examples in my AI class, and we basically had the sense that these statistical methods, because they're literally statistical methods, they're trained on millions of sentences, that they couldn't really get a true understanding of language. Now, then ChatGPT happened. They trained it 3.5. So that's GPT 3.5, the next version, and now GPT-4. And suddenly, almost all these common sense reasoning examples are easily done by ChatGPT. This is what we call an emergent phenomena. Suddenly, these language models could actually get at common sense reasoning. Now, common sense reasoning in AI had been a 60-year open problem. It was actually identified by the founder of AI, John McCarthy, as one of the key problems that humans are good at and machines are terrible at. Suddenly, this problem is solved, okay? And so this was a whole transformation. Everything I taught in the fall was that wasn't actually quite true anymore. Now, why does this get to Gödel and Wittgenstein? I taught my graduate class in the spring, and we started looking more carefully at what is the meaning of a sentence. How do you look at the semantics of a sentence? And you immediately get to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was actually one of the first, philosophers that really carefully thought about how does a sentence, an English sentence or a German sentence, gets its meaning? What makes a sentence true? He actually believed that if we could really analyze language and understand semantics very well of language, we would be able to distinguish true statements from false statements. We could have ways of getting at very deep philosophical questions and questions about what's true and false in this world. And so Wittgenstein had actually what's called a pictorial representational theory in his Tractatus, his famous philosophy text. His Tractatus lays out a theory of how you can get at the semantics of language. Now, why is Gödel there? Now, we went back to Wittgenstein and said, okay, he already was the first one to think of the semantics of language. And then Gödel fits in because Gödel thought of the semantics of formal languages, like logic. And in particular, what are the limits of formal languages? And Gödel identified the incompleteness theorem, where he says we can't fully capture mathematical truths in a formal language. And this was like a revelation that the formal logic is not quite powerful enough to capture all of mathematical truths. Okay, so between and Wittgenstein and Gödel both thought of sort of what can you do with language and how powerful our language is and how good our language is. Now, Wittgenstein actually, after his Tractatus, in the later part of his life, the second phase of his career, basically, he actually moved away from his Tractatus theory about the meaning of language. And basically he said, no, it's not about how it refers to the real world. Language, the semantic of language is much more about the interaction between people and how languages are used. So he basically got much more to this notion of potentially you don't really need the world. The semantics actually is more the result of when we communicate, when we interact with each other. You talked about language games. That language gets its semantics from its use. And this really is striking, because that's actually what ChatGPT gets its semantics from. It gets its understanding of language from the sentences it sees. The ChatGPT has no perception of the world. It actually doesn't interact with the world at all. It just sees hundreds and thousands and millions of example sentences. Okay, so my sense is that Wittgenstein would be very happy to see ChatGPT work, because that's sort of what he thought was the real semantics of language. And of course, this was way before computers, way before GPUs, way before data. So he could not really have anticipated this technological development. But this is, I guess, what Wittgenstein sort of thought at the end of his life, that where semantics came from this interaction, just the sentence itself. So that's why I think when I did my course, we went back to the Wittgenstein work and we went back to his theories about semantics, and I think he was surprisingly accurate and foresaw these developments in some sense. So that's my introduction, why I put it together now. So the second part, why does Gödel fit in? Well, Gödel made this thing. There was a feeling within logic and symbolic logic, and that there's a real distinction between formal languages and natural language, that they're very different. The formal language is very precise. Natural language is ambiguous, has context, is much more complex. And we sort of had this sense that these were very different entities. And actually computer science and mathematicians, most people actually believed this. If you work with ChatGPT, you realize, wait a minute, ChatGPT is just as good as writing formal logic as it is at generating programs. Like, it can generate Python code, and you ask it to write a program, it writes a program, 1,000-line program, you can run it. So ChatGPT is also challenging this assumption that a formal language is very different from a natural language, because it actually does both, and it actually has no trouble switching between the languages. This is interesting from a scientific point of view. If you look at a mathematics paper has English text and formalism interwoven, combining the two. And it may actually be that is the best way to represent science and mathematics, in a combination of natural language and formal languages. So ChatGPT brings those together. And I think that would have surprised Gödel, and that would have possibly surprised Wittgenstein. But this is my short introduction. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I'm passing it.
Yeah, I think Bart gave a great perspective. You know, and in fact, he highlighted this idea that, ChatGPT can actually learn from context. And I think that's how it connects to Wittgenstein, that, the context. And if you think of ChatGPT is really, training on these gigantic volumes of data, and it finds a way of encoding this gigantic knowledge to this very powerful representation that is, in the end, capable of providing the context of, all these entities, and in fact, in a very compact way, has a very good understanding of the world. And what I find also fascinating is also, again, Bart mentioned a bit this issue of syntax and semantic. When we think about language, there's the syntax, the rules that we use to speak a language. For example, in English, we would say the White House. We know that the adjective comes before the noun. But in Portuguese, I would say actually Casa Branca. So it is house white, and it's a valid rule. So, and now the question is ChatGPT just using syntactic rules? And we know, because ChatGPT is essentially predicting the next word, and it's heavily based on syntax, correct? However, because of this power representation, it actually ends up understanding the context. And this context, there's where the semantics all of a sudden jumps in. And so, and again, it's a bit what Bart pointed out, that you learn it by the interaction. And it's not that really ChatGPT is interacting with the real world, but it sees how people are using the language, and it is capable of compressing all the information into this representation that really gives you tremendous power to understand what's going on, So it's really this emerging behavior of common sense, but because it was able to develop this representation and essentially based on language, which takes us to another question that I find fascinating is, ChatGPT is just predicting the next word. So, but by doing this, it develops these capabilities, and maybe that's why we develop, our intelligence, because we have to communicate. We have to interact, and that's how intelligence emerges. So.
So I make the quick glance in the room. Okay, no question. Great, I can pose my question. Since you have Wittgenstein in your title, I cannot but get also philosophical, because you mentioned the truth before. And when we see systems like ChatGPT, which are now implied into Microsoft systems, and we had already these experiences with, people like making Dan out of ChatGPT, so it will give all the bad answers, so to say, that we don't want to have as a society. So like why torture is good, for example. So, but we could say then, who owns the truth? As we think it's good that there is no Dan anymore, but it's one company which is private who says, this is true, this is what ChatGPT gives you, provides you as the truth. And in the same thing is very many people, we still are there. Digital humanism can't solve it all in itself. Believing that because it's a system, because it seems so human, it might be way more right than any human could ever be, and we try to not, give all the responsibility to difficult decisions to systems like that. And this is like the Damocles sword also being there, but it's also a question of ownership when these systems arrive, because I think Mr. Musk said, I will invent something that then will be called Truth GPT with the data of Twitter users. You decide if that's truth then. I hope it was a punchline and he just tried to be funny, but I'm never sure with him. So is in the context also of Wittgenstein, of course, and his search for the truth, what might be the truth with artificial intelligence like ChatGPT or large language models, is this also a new challenge for us and the ownership of truth?
Yeah, no, this is a very good issue, and I think we have to be. First thing, it will be an educational journey for people. We have to understand that these ChatGPT can hallucinate, can make up things. The notion of truth, that's what Wittgenstein had the hope that if he could understand language well and understand semantics of language well, that there would be some sort of mathematical way of getting at the truth. He did give up on that, so he realized that there is no magical way of getting at the truth, and I think he's probably right about that. So I think we have to be a little careful and say, okay, how do we get a notion of truth? And yeah, in my own opinion, the scientific method and sort of what is factually true, what can be shown to be factually false, are still sort of the truth is something that needs to be debated, and people need to convince each other. We do see, unfortunately, in our society, and you see it in the US, but I think you see it in Europe too, probably that there are people that no longer believe in sort of rational arguments or in even scientific arguments. And that's actually a real risk. And I don't think ChatGPT will solve that for us. It will. Although I tell my students, I want you to think of ChatGPT not as a chatbot, but more as a very knowledgeable, as a knowledgeable teacher or tutor. And so as a professor, for example, when I wanted to talk, even when I knew Wittgenstein was related to ChatGPT, and the first thing I did is, well, tell me, how Wittgenstein's approach to language changed over time. And ChatGPT will give you an explanation that's clearer than almost any explanation you can come up with yourself. So it is extremely good at explaining complex subject matter. And I think it is so good at that because it knows so many different topics. So it actually, if you ask it about relationship between philosophy and mathematics and computer science, the explanations you'll get are remarkably clear. I know they're correct because I sort of know the relationship, so I ask it questions that I knew what the answer would be, but the explanations that ChatGPT comes up with are very good. So I encourage students to use ChatGPT as a knowledge source, but then always be careful when it comes to sort of factual information that references, citations, and things like that. So that you have to double check. So I think ChatGPT will be a positive contribution in this able to give us scientific knowledge and world knowledge. But the truth, I think, is a whole other can of worms. And actually, I'm hoping that we're going to have further investigations in how do we get better at the truth. Unfortunately, I cannot be too optimistic because I know that when people no longer believe in the scientific method, they no longer believe in empirical science, then it actually becomes very hard to get a consensus around the truths and facts. So that's I think it's a sociological problem we have run into. I think the school system is in some sense not quite working, or the internet is amplifying attitudes that are unfortunately unscientific and will cause trouble getting at the truth. So.
So perhaps I would start by saying that indeed, I agree with Bart that ChatGPT is an amazing tool, and it actually can provide very interesting explanations. In fact, yesterday I gave a talk about computational sustainability, and then I asked ChatGPT to define computational sustainability for a 10-year-old, and I thought the definition was amazing. And even other definitions, they are very good, very comprehensive, and maybe better than my own definition. And I came up, I've been doing this field for a while. Indeed, then I ask for a source, give me source, and it gives me, for example, a CACM paper, which is, the Communications of ACM. It's a very prestigious journal. And actually puts me as an author and other people, but it's made up, so it's all made up. But it's made up, but actually it's in a different, it has bits of truth there. And maybe technically, what is the explanation for this? And so that's, I think we need to be aware that you can think of, and I mentioned before that, ChatGPT is, basically trained on vast amounts of data, and then, has this representation that is going to compress this knowledge. And so it's, there's some loss. So it's what we say, a lossy compression, correct? And therefore, it's used to, compressing, and therefore it has troubles with facts, because a citation is verbatim. You really need to give the right citation, and ChatGPT, currently, is going to summarize the citation. Well, you cannot do that with a citation. A citation is a citation, correct? So I think this problem is going to be fixed very soon. But there's, and at a higher level, I also think it's a great tool. But indeed, at this point, I have to admit that I ask questions that I know the answers, or I have a vague idea of the answers, but then I'm surprised that the answers that it gives are, way more comprehensive than what I would come up with. So, it is a great tool, and I think it's going to get better and better. And just like Bart, I actually for my course where I, taught. Actually, I have also a course on computational sustainability, or an intro course, but there, it's still a math course, and I thought that, ChatGPT is going to be a disaster when it comes to math. For example, we talked about, carbon dating or things where you have to know about exponential models, you have to the half-life models, etc. And to my surprise, I would ask concrete mathematical questions, and ChatGPT was perfect. Or I would check, because and then I would realize, oh, you forgot the initial condition, and ChatGPT would say, oh yeah, I forgot the initial condition, and it would fix it, but then it would be right, So, I mean, it is, it's extraordinary how in, 6 months the progress has been incredible. Indeed, we need safeguards for sure, and we can think of, ChatGPT being used for misinformation, for creating, fictitious worlds, and frankly, unfortunately, we have seen a lot of that without ChatGPT, with other social media platforms where they're driven maybe by, what is going to generate more clicks or more, So, this is a reality, and AI, I like to emphasize that, AI, and I'm pursuing AI for good, for a better world, but AI can also be used for not so good purposes, and there's obviously a need to create safeguards and think about also the risks associated with such an amazing technology. But maybe I'll stop here now.
I will so much show off that I was able to share a microphone with you. And we have a question.
Okay. Since you talk about knowledge, I wanted to act as a devil advocate. So it reminds me of wisdom hierarchy, right? From data, we go to information, we go to knowledge, we go to wisdom, right? So as academics, how should we use ChatGPT that would not undermine the wisdom, and also the wisdom of crowds, right? Something that makes us very successful as human and social animals is the fact that we have this wisdom of crowds, right? Independent way of thinking and knowledging, right?
There you go.
So I like the idea that you bring up the notion of knowledge, and you go one level higher, wisdom. And so because I used to make that distinction very much between data. Machine learning deals with a lot of data and sort of finds patterns, and knowledge I put one level higher. Knowledge is the kind of thing you learn from textbooks, and Newton's law is a piece of knowledge. That's no longer data, and it's exactly that jump going from data to knowledge. That's actually, but I'll get to the wisdom. So from data to knowledge that ChatGPT has made, I think that's sort of, and honestly, it surprised me big time. So because that's when I in my introductory class last fall, I said like it doesn't really get at knowledge, but ChatGPT does. And it gets the knowledge from reading. So you say like, how do wisdom of the crowds? That's actually, I think, one of the powers of ChatGPT is it has read so much. And my explanation for why it gives such good explanations is, if you ask it about the relationship between fields, and again between Wittgenstein and Gödel and Turing, I asked the relationship between those three. It's surprisingly clear about that, and I think it's so clear about it because it knows a lot about philosophy, it knows a lot about mathematics, and it knows a lot about computer science. Almost more than any individual person does. So you're dealing with this entity that knows those three areas, but it also knows biology, it also knows chemistry. So that's almost the wisdom of the crowd is actually inside it, because it has read, I think, 1.5 terabyte of text. It also has fed, by the way, it's trained on textbooks. They're actually a little quiet about that, but there was so the rumor is that there was the Russian site where you could get a PDF of any book in the world. I love that site. In the US, the FBI has shut it down. I'm not sure in Europe, but I think it should be a human resource. You could get any book, any PDF in the middle of the night. You could look something up. So the rumor is that they actually made a deal with that site. The PDF still exists, and ChatGPT read those textbooks many times, more than the blogs, more than the web. The web, it's too noisy. So because I think textbooks actually do have true knowledge and in some sense have wisdom. Now, the multiple perspective, I think you're raising a very interesting point. So we now see people working on systems that let ChatGPT develop different types of arguments. So the other thing I like to stress is that people say, well, it just predicts the next word. That's actually a little misleading. It technically predicts the next word, but then it puts it in its buffer. So it puts it in the context. So now when it thinks about the word after that, it takes the previous word it just thought of into account. Okay. So why is it so incredibly coherent when it, let's say, outputs 1,000 lines of Python code? It can do that because it keeps all the previous Python code it has written in its memory. So it actually sort of is able to think about what it just has thought. Okay, and if you think of human thought, our own mind works a little bit like that. We get new ideas, and then we take what we just thought of and say, oh, this brings me to another direction. So wisdom might actually come by having ChatGPT argue with itself, okay? And that's possible to do. So I think we're at the brink of people starting to experiment with that. What happens if I let ChatGPT just think about, I don't know, some topics, think about ethics, and then it can start thinking and argue with itself. A little bit about, for example, facts. So it is bad at citations, or it's bad at certain facts, but it actually knows it's bad at it. So you can actually ask very early on, I asked ChatGPT, does the proof of 1 + 1 = 2 occur in Principia Mathematica, which is a famous textbook by Russell and Whitehead, and it is about the foundation of mathematics. And ChatGPT first says, no, the proof of 1 + 1 = 2 is too simplistic to be in that book. That book is about the foundation of mathematics. And then you say, well, are you sure? And then it says, well, wait a minute, I haven't read it. So I guess it didn't read Principia Mathematica. But he said, wait a minute, it is about the foundation of Mathematica, so maybe it could be in the book because it is a very fundamental fact of mathematics. And then I asked, how would you find out? Okay, and he said, well, I would need to get the PDF of the book, and then I would look to the table of contents, whether it's mentioned, and if I can't find it in the table of contents, I would have to go to the text and search for the statement 1 + 1 = 2, but I have to be careful because the theorem might be worded slightly differently. So I have to actually see different variations of that theorem. So it actually has a notion of how to look up facts. It just didn't have the book. Okay, so there's things that are now people starting to experiment with, okay, how can I get ChatGPT to verify the truth, in some of the factual truths? And these things are possible. So the wisdom I had not heard of before, and that might actually be another level. But ChatGPT could do that. I'm impressed by just the pure breadth of knowledge. And for a professor, it actually is a strange time, because when I prepare my lectures, I say, like, wait a minute. Professor, you're in a weird situation. You actually say, do my students get more out of interacting with ChatGPT about Wittgenstein than talking to me? Well, it's a toss-up, you know. So they actually, ChatGPT provides, so I encourage all students to just use it, and use it as a teaching tool. Use it as a very, very good tutor, very good teacher to interact with, always keeping in mind to double-check things when it comes to factual things. So, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll pick up on, this notion that, ChatGPT is to some extent a new kind of intelligence compared to human intelligence. Exactly, and to some extent, because of this capability of becoming an expert in so many areas, as I like Bart emphasized that, because ChatGPT has been trained on math, ecology. By the way, my ecologist friends say that, yes, the answers are way better than their own answers, or physics, astronomy, etc. So, and because indeed, again, it has been trained and has this representation that is going to, basically represent a word with, all this context, it has a good perspective across so many dimensions that it has a whole new level of intelligence that, it's a little almost foreign to us. And this was, one of the comments of one of the key figures in AI and deep learning, Hinton, who you may know that he won the Turing Award because of, he was one of the inventors of deep learning, and then he was working for Google, and actually recently stepped down because he decided that maybe there were now conflicts of interest because he sees the evolution of these models. But the point that I want to emphasize is he has been interested in understanding human intelligence and realizes that ChatGPT is very different, and it's very different. And he even said probably better. It's getting better than us, and it is in part exactly because of this capability of thinking at very high dimensions and bringing together the context from, bridging philosophy, pure math, computer science, law, astronomy, etc. That it has this incredible power that is beyond us, and that's exciting, and we can use ChatGPT for understanding topics in a much deeper way than before. But Bart mentioned the first thing we do. Let's see what ChatGPT has to say. Again, I think it's important, especially, we need to be careful and make sure that maybe, one direction is to have a verifier of, what ChatGPT is outputting, but indeed, this capability of bringing together a variety of topics, I think it's really powerful and quite interesting. And back to your question, data, knowledge, wisdom, yes, maybe it gets a higher level of wisdom, but at the same time, maybe that it's going to be also very context dependent. You know, I wonder actually how ChatGPT in, you know, across different countries, across different languages, if it has, you know, capture, you know, cultural issues. That actually is a question I'm curious about that.
Thank you for the talk. Yeah, I really liked your observation that the Wittgenstein move from logical reduction to meaningless use is very quite apt also for AI. And actually, it's not just, you know, Wittgenstein, because analytic philosophy in general did kind of that pragmatic move. And you also see this move away from logic also in cognitive psychology and linguistics. So my question may be a bit controversial considering the audience, but since we have this move away from logic in other related areas to artificial intelligence, and also this obvious successfulness of ChatGPT and other symbolic AI systems, what exactly is the remaining role of logic in artificial intelligence? And that's the negative question. And also, can we still, if that's like devastating for logic, is there still a role that logic can play in augmenting AI?
You're eager to answer.
I love that question. And I've thought about it because I did a lot of work, well, on logic. So I think there definitely is a role. I think actually what ChatGPT shows to me is the combination of natural language and logical formula. Where is logic needed for science and engineering? So to get to a level of to scientific progress, and I'm a little flexible when I say logic. I mean actually any formal language. So I include programming languages, formal languages. I include mathematics, mathematical formalisms. I see them as they're not natural language. They are, you know, formalized. I group them all in logic. So that may be a little controversial. But so I contrast any sort of language that's not natural language, that's not English, German or whatever, as a formal language. And those formal languages were essential for progress in science and mathematics. So those are actually very important. We couldn't do without them. We couldn't engineer a bridge without having mathematical formalism, or doing science or mathematics. So I think they're very important. What I love about ChatGPT is actually blurring the lines. It actually is just as easily generates Python code or a mathematical formula as it generates English. So it actually shows that these languages are not that different. But there are, you know, if you take Newton's law, MA, that law captures a very fundamental property of gravity, of our physical world, and is super powerful. And ChatGPT has no trouble thinking about that. So I think that there is a real role for that. The second part of your question is, you know, should we still pursue that kind of research? Yes, about pure logic. Logic, and this is back to Wittgenstein a bit, is that Wittgenstein did believe that if we make our arguments more precise, that perhaps we can actually, if we agree on the assumptions of our arguments, that and if we agree to be rational, then logic is a way to settle arguments, to argue about things. And this goes all the way back to the Greeks, you know, that invented first order logic, partly to be able to reason more properly in court about societal rules, about governance. So I actually think there is a rule for logic, and perhaps this bridging of going from language, from natural language, to more precise formal languages can be helped with the ChatGPT approach. You can actually say, I have a legal argument here. Give me the logical structure of it. And now you can actually run a theorem prover. You can run a separate program and say, check this argument. And so I actually think that this is an opportunity to build more on those formal languages because our society has benefited a lot from them. So that would be my response.
Okay, I'm going to be a little, I think you are being too generous on ChatGPT. I think there's an incredible role for pursuing logic and symbolic AI, and ChatGPT is far from being there, and to some extent is, we think of ChatGPT. ChatGPT is again trained on data, and it's reasoning based on training and using data. But for example, yesterday I tried to emphasize that if we want scientific discovery, if we want mathematical discovery, we often, in fact, scientists are brilliant and they pick up little things and then they use all their knowledge to derive new knowledge. And therefore, I think there's a tremendous role there for symbolic AI, for us to push the frontiers of knowledge. And frankly, I think that's not how ChatGPT at this point is really designed. ChatGPT is designed to really, compress and generate knowledge from the data. But if we want, creativity completely outside the box, we really need, to reason from first principles. That's what scientists do, and for that, I really think we need the role of, a formal method of reasoning. I agree that there are the seeds there, and the ChatGPT can use language, etc. It can program, etc. But again, it was trained on programs to learn how to program. It's way more challenging if I'm now going to say, okay, I want you to come up with, a scientific discovery, and I want you to discover a new amazing semiconductor. Maybe it can give you some ideas, but it really needs to put together the knowledge and from first principle reason, and I think that's where we can make a big difference. And my own work, I have, really emphasized this AI for scientific discovery, exactly because I think it's the frontier where, ChatGPT is far from being there. And of course, I think, we can push it, but I see a fundamental role for foundational AI to really, in fact, I think the next generation of solvers are going to do this symbiosis, between, data crunching and machine learning and symbolic AI. So that's the next generation, and so that we can generate new knowledge, be creative, and be able to actually, in fact, the vision is maybe someday we can have an AI that will win a Nobel Prize. But to do that, we really need to be able to incorporate more, principle reasoning and make, a system that generalizes better outside the training data. I mentioned this. In fact, there was a great question. What's the role of symbolic AI or constraints? Well, you want to be able to, if I give you a Sudoku on numbers, then, and train on that, obviously if I then replace the numbers with animals, you know how to solve it because you immediately generalize. Well, a machine learning method would not know how to generalize this. So I think please, in fact, keep working on your symbolic logic, on your foundation, and because I really think this is what's missing from the current systems. It is, how to incorporate these reasoning capabilities, beyond the data you train on. And I hope I was not too technical. Oh, and I still didn't use your Microsoft.
I think we could discuss for hours because I don't believe half of what you're saying. I have a very different view of ChatGPT. I think ChatGPT is a system that reproduces language and is very good at it and nothing else. There are emergent properties that are very interesting and fascinating, but we are fascinated by them because it's language, and language is so important to the way we think about the world and how we see the world, that language deceives us into seeing things that are not there. And let me just point out one small detail. You talk about ChatGPT as if it's an entity. It knows that's the start of it. It knows, it thinks, it hallucinates. And I think using these terms is a mistake because there is no it. ChatGPT is not an entity that has agency. It's a system, a large language. It's not even an AI in my opinion. It's a large language model, which is not an AI system. And it talks our texts back to us. It talks everything we ever wrote, the world has ever written, yes. It talks everything back to us and it does nothing else. If it gets good at these suitcase statue examples, the reason is that those have been written a lot about. And if I come up with a totally new one, ChatGPT will again fail because ChatGPT still fails in these models. There is the famous example of the breast milk and the crushed porcelain, why it's good to add crushed porcelain to breast milk. And in its way, ChatGPT talked about that in the deepest tone of conviction that it's good to do that. Because there is no knowledge in it. There is only language reproduction that is so good that we project knowledge into it and that we think it is actually an entity. And I think this is wrong. We shouldn't do that.
I'm just a journalist here, but NLP is also a part of ChatGPT, if I'm not mistaken. Just saying. I'm bringing the microphone to you.
Hi, yeah. So it's a very good point you're making, and I believed it until the fall of 22. So let me give my perspective, and this is where I think Jeff Hinton similarly had this revelation. I've been in the field for, 30 years. I've tried to do common sense reasoning for 30 years. So I what I see is there are a few AI research, and Jeff Hinton is one of them, and Josh Bengio actually, where we have worked on certain kinds of problems like common sense reasoning, knowledge representation for decades, and basically did not make much progress. In fact, there's a book, The Challenge of Common Sense Reasoning, written by Ron Brachman and Hector Levac, sort of like two main figures in knowledge representation, came out in the fall of 2022. And I featured it in my course. I said, hey, this is what these language models can't do. You take those examples that they give in the book, you type them in ChatGPT 4.0, and they get answered perfectly. And so basically, to me, it was just a revelation that, wait a minute, what I think could not be done for 6 decades can suddenly be done. People say, and as you say, oh, it's just because it has seen examples. That brings me back to Wittgenstein, in the sense that Wittgenstein said, well, maybe, language is learned, and semantic language is learned from interacting and using language. All we have seen is examples. And this is what humans do. And, you may agree, but what I want to warn you about is that I think you are, and this is why Hinton almost feels sad, because he's emotionally disturbed by this, is that he sees the risk of this. That basically, and going back to AI again, I worked a lot in planning and in theory improving. And the problem we had in planning and theory improving was you tried to construct a long sequence of actions to start with some initial state, a long sequence of actions to get to a goal. And we were able to do 100 steps in my work. We were able to add that to 1,000 steps, but we weren't really be able to do it the way humans plan. And the way humans plan is they have a high-level goal. I want to travel back to New York. They break that down in sub-goals. They break it down in I have to get the plane ticket. I have to, get to the airport, and all kinds of details that we fill in. We work in what's called hierarchical planning. And basically people said, the way we do and why humans are so good at planning, we know how to subdivide the problem into subtasks. Okay, what was the problem with that approach from a computational point of view is we didn't know how humans got to these sub-goals, how humans figured out, oh, I can break this big task up into 10 different sub-goals I have to achieve. You ask ChatGPT, and it will give you the sub-goals. So suddenly we have this entity that can do hierarchical planning that we couldn't do 6 months ago. So there are all these areas of AI that I suddenly see progress that I haven't seen for decades. Now I can say, well, that's just statistics, but I think there we're missing the point. If I see technical progress of things we're trying to do, mathematical theorem proof, I've worked on it for again, 3 decades. It's embarrassing how little progress we've made on fully automated theorem proving. But now we can, because ChatGPT will actually say, if you solve this sub-goal and then that sub-goal and then that sub-goal, then you can put together a proof. Okay, so if you ask ChatGPT, give me an outline of a possible proof, it will come up with an outline of a possible proof. Now we can fill that in. Again, these are technical advances that weren't possible 6 months ago. So that's, for Jeff Hinton, it was when he saw ChatGPT understand why a statement was humorous. Why there was humor in a statement. There was no AI system that could detect humor. That was sort of humor was typically human. So it's these facts, I think, that AI researchers, I think a subset of AI researchers realize, gee, we've tried this for decades. Suddenly it's doable. Something new has happened. Now you can say maybe it's just statistics. Well, maybe it is just statistics. It's still. So if I had to ask what is open to do, another question, I'm an AI researcher, what is left to do in AI? Not so clear what is left to do in AI, which is a very strange statement to make. It's not so clear what's left to do in AI. Is it autonomous or not? Well, I see the language model, and this is actually even people confused by it. Well, it doesn't have autonomy. It can't just think of its own. It doesn't have can't reflect on itself. It's just a feed-forward network, technically. Well, actually, the language model, one of the big changes of compared to standard machine learning, a standard machine learning approach takes, let's say, an image of a camera, and then outputs like cat or dog, whatever is in the image, gives it a label. The input space is very different from the output space. That's a standard machine learning approach. You label something, a disease, I give you symptoms, I give you some diagnostic test, it can predict a disease, with some probability. A language model, the input is a set of tokens, a set of words. The output is a word, okay, or a token. You put that back into the input. So you can actually take that feed-forward network, as we call it, which indeed has no memory or anything, it just works feed-forward, but now in the loop, it becomes a Turing machine. It becomes computationally, it has a Turing machine with a finite length state, but the computer also has a finite memory. So it actually has the loop external to the model. So I actually think it can reflect on itself by the architecture, because the architecture works in the same space. The input space and the output space are the same space. So these are technical points that I do think are a very different architecture than we normally think of a machine learning system or a feed-forward network. And so that's where I am. And I ask me now, what needs to be done in AI? I'm not so sure what needs to be done now. And so that is why some people are worried. I think is too strong a term. But as Carla said, we do have an entity that is sort of a Renaissance person, I guess as we would call it. Like a person who knows about 100 or 1,000 different topics. So I even think that, for example, when it comes to legal reasoning, so there's a big question now, is ChatGPT going to do legal reasoning? And I say, yes, for sure it's going to do legal reasoning. Why is it going to do legal reasoning? Why is it a problem? It's a problem for lawyers? Yeah, it's a problem for lawyers. It's not going to replace the $1,000 an hour lawyer. We have a few of those. Some lawyers you can pay $1,000. They'll make the amazing argument. But most people can only afford a $200 an hour lawyer or a $300 an hour lawyer. Those lawyers are not particularly good, okay? And ChatGPT will be better than those lawyers. We've used some lawyers ourselves, and those guys are not that great. ChatGPT will do a better job. So there's a whole bunch of areas of human expertise where you say if you're not in the top 5% or the top 1%, ChatGPT is probably going to do a pretty good job at your job. So yeah, it's just a chatbot, but it's a pretty darn powerful chatbot. And you know, is that AI? Is it intelligence? I think it has all the aspects of intelligence, and that's my view of this model. So.
Okay. Yes, so I do think that Bart is projecting a bit in the future, and we are far from being there. And there, I think there's a lot to do in terms of AI to make, ChatGPT better. I already highlighted, for example, the need of combining symbolic AI with more machine learning-based techniques and large language models, as we know. But I do see a bit your statement that you say, oh, there's a brain, But indeed, maybe I see your point. I will, and I know we need to wrap up soon, correct? But I will give you another perspective that actually I'm going maybe wearing my pedagogical hat. I underestimated the power of data in my early career. In my early career, I was really focused on symbolic AI, logic, reasoning, and I believe in it. But I was, and in fact, even as a kid, I had this thing that I wanted to derive everything from first principles, including I didn't want to memorize the multiplication table because I thought that was silly. I should derive everything from first principles. Later on, and luckily not that late, I realized now memory is important. Memory is a super important capability and a part of us. So you actually should memorize things because that's important. But in my career, I think I saw you at the talk yesterday. No. So maybe somebody else. I gave this talk about, scientific discovery and basically trying to solve a key question in material science, that is understanding the structure of materials. It's a very, like understanding the structure of DNA. And I admit we start by trying to solve this problem with, just logic and using language, formal language such as satisfiability, etc. And it was great at, synthetic examples with no noise, etc. But when we would go to the real world, it just didn't work. And so very soon we realized that no, we actually have to, because the data actually contain a strong signal. And we need to take advantage of the data. And we need to combine the data and then combine with physics and scientific principles that we can reason from first principles. But the point that I'm trying to make is, the data and having access to this incredible amount of data, that makes ChatGPT very powerful. Yes, I think we need to still develop, other ways of being able to not just repeat the data, as you said, being more creative, etc. But frankly, a lot has already been done. Before, AI couldn't really do any common sense. If I would ask an AI, can a child pick up a house? It would not know what to say, and we know if it is a toy, yes, but if it's a real house, now, ChatGPT probably can answer that question and many other questions. So we see this incredible development, and I really don't like the statement Bart makes, there's nothing to do. That's I actually don't agree.
I'll modify that slightly.
Okay, now this is getting into more interesting where we are arguing. But you see, it is, at a high level, it is this, you see this power of data to some extent, and but ChatGPT at the same time is learning how to reason a bit. We need to push that facet, but I believe that it's not just it's not just like an Eliza or repeating. It is way more profound than that, or just the Amazon Turk where there's somebody. No, it has reached the level that is beyond, in several subjects beyond, you don't see a person who can be so prolific across different domains as ChatGPT, and that's incredible. So, I think.
Yeah, we were just before the wrap-up session, and I think this with the surprise will be working. I trust you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I actually want to come back to where we started about semantics, and to ask you maybe to imagine how this system will look like. We'll have this semantic understanding, and how can we actually check if ChatGPT has or does not have it already? Thanks.
Short.
Yeah, short. So I think it probably is not a simple yes, no, it has semantics or not. I think it has way more semantic understanding now than the previous model. So even if I take ChatGPT 3.0 versus ChatGPT 4, ChatGPT 4 has way more semantic understanding. And with semantics, I mean understanding the words similarly to human understanding. And that we can test basically on benchmarks and things like that. So it's not it has semantics or I don't think it has semantics or it doesn't have semantics. It has much more semantics now, and that's actually, I think, a reasonable perspective. So yeah.
I agree.
Actually, a Stanford study showed that it passed the test GPT-4 with theory of mind, which I found interesting. So, and you were the last question.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the analogy with Wittgenstein, which I think is really important, can deliver a lot. But as academics, we also have to be precise and say where the analogy stops and where it breaks down. Let me just make a case for early and late Wittgenstein. For early Wittgenstein, where the world is everything that is the case, the world is the totality of facts and not of things, and so on and so forth, until whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. We are in a logic picture. Now, for ChatGPT, there is this Valuigi conjecture that says for very large language models where you have P, you can also provide a prompt that produces non-P. Since not both P and non-P can be true, the question arises, are we immediately out of early Wittgenstein because the picture breaks down? Right? So that's one limit. Okay. Now for late Wittgenstein, while I would agree that there is a lot, Wittgenstein wanted to do with context, but really I think he was moving towards things we do with language. And there is this famous praying, playing, greeting. Now, as a philosopher, I would argue ChatGPT is doing none of those things. It's certainly not praying. It's never greeting, really, because I think I have to agree, it is actually just repeating in a Searlean sense, meaningless squiggle-squoggle that refer to each other.
What is the question?
I think he got the question.
Okay, great. So, you know the question.
Yeah. So first of all, if you're an expert on Wittgenstein, I totally give you the floor for that. So the analogy was sort of at a higher level, but I do think that the change of Wittgenstein from his first phase to his second phase was interesting in the context of ChatGPT. The squiggly lines, I guess this is basically the Chinese room argument you're making. And the philosophers and computer scientists have always strongly disagreed about that. To me, but this is the old argument. Neurons in the brain, add up activity and compute some number. You could argue the brain is just doing some computation on signals. That's not, that's like the Chinese room. The brain cannot understand based on that argument. So we, as computer science, we don't really see that objection. And so yeah, when I said we don't know actually just what to do in AI, the problem for AI researchers right now is I can do research, but OpenAI is going to come out with ChatGPT, GPT-5, and so there's a problem that these models they have this seemingly exponential phase transition phenomenon that suddenly they start doing tasks that they couldn't do at all or only could do at 5% accuracy. They suddenly start doing at 90% accuracy. If GPT-5 comes out, the work I may be doing today could be total. It's definitely true that there are a lot of AI researchers in natural language, in reasoning, in planning, whose grand proposals really, became obsolete with the release of GPT-4. So that's sort of more what we're struggling with. That okay, how can I do AI research if GPT-5 will do a lot of things that I would try to do? But for Wittgenstein, I give it totally to you. Yeah.
Well, the world is more than large language models and more than NLP. So yeah, I think your view is very narrow, to be honest. And I will say that ChatGPT really is benefiting from all the work we have done. And the transformers, deep learning, search, reinforcement learning. In fact, ChatGPT combines, transformers and the more standard machine learning with, reinforcement learning that is more a la symbolic AI in order to actually make the system more human. And yeah, what's going to happen is, and that's what happens with, the whole area of AI and ML, that's whatever we do gets incorporated and makes systems, better and better and better. But it is because we are doing this. And indeed, what's going to happen is probably OpenAI, the next invention that Stefan comes up with in terms of integrating symbolic AI and, developing better explanations, yeah, they will incorporate all of this in ChatGPT. But there's plenty of work to do in AI, and this is just the beginning. It is incredible. I mean, we see progress much faster than what we thought. I think that is our surprise. It's like with the invention of the printing press. Then there was an explosion, but it was not the end of the books. That's when things started, and I think there's a beautiful journey for researchers ahead of us, and there's a lot of work to do. And we will have, a year from now, a way better ChatGPT or whatever you call it, with, that incorporates all our ideas. And please continue pushing all your ideas, because I think there's a lot of exciting work to do.
Amen. So thank you so much for having been here. Time's over already, but we're going to end where we started, with you.
So for me, it remains only to say several thank yous. Thank you to you all who came here, listened and engaged in the conversation. I think this is a topic that one cannot deal with within 60 hours. I think there are more open questions than have been answered, but I think that's actually maybe even the one reason of doing these things. Many thanks for doing this, for coming here and sharing your insight. So thank you, Carla. Thank you, Bart. Thank you, Sarah, for this moderation. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon at another LogicLounge. Thank you.